Hey guys, my name is Nicholas, and today I want to talk to you about grace versus the grace card. Because I think it's important to understand that even as adults, especially even as kids, we are trained to be responsible for our own actions, and we're instructed as kids to have good morals, to have good judgment, to do the right thing. And we don't see a lot of that in kids today, but the fact is grace, according to Titus 2:11-12, teaches us to deny ungodly lust, to live soberly, righteous, and godly in this present world. And it's the grace of God through instruction to overcome sin and live a godly life. The grace is not a license to sin, but it's a license to righteousness. It's living a godly life. Because Paul says, shall we continue to sin that grace may abound? And Paul answers it with another question. It says, how we're dead to sin, living longer in it. So even when we do sin, according to for 1 John chapter 2, we have an advocate with the Father, and God forgives us. But it doesn't take away the consequences of our action. It doesn't mean sin is not dealt with. And when sin is being dealt with, people don't want to, especially if they're insecure in this area, they want the grace card. They don't want to be punished for their sins, and they don't want to get in trouble. They want to get out of trouble as much as possible. But the fact is that even when we do sin, Jesus died for us on the cross, and He has forgiveness of all our sins, past, present, and future. And in order to access that forgiveness, we need to receive it by faith and say, Lord, thank you for forgiving me of this sin. And I think a lot of us are carrying shame and guilt and condemnation over stuff that God's already forgiven us for. When we ask Him to forgive us, He's already done so. But yet, I think a lot of times when we do get in trouble, we're not sure how to process that. And because of that, a lot of us feel condemned because of our issues. And the fact is, even in troubling situations, God's grace is there to pick us back up when we humbly turn from our sin and turn to Christ. God's grace is always there to pick us back up. Now, it doesn't erase the consequences of our sin, and it doesn't mean that sin is not dealt with. But it means that God's grace is always there. Now, a lot of times, like I said earlier in this video, people tend to, especially toxic people, whenever they don't want people dealing with their problems, they want to show sympathy or have the grace card, or sympathy, same thing. They want people to feel sorry for them and stuff, and they want people to, when they do something wrong, that kind of like on the freeway, they don't want the police writing them a ticket. They want to get away scotch-free. They don't want to learn from their mistakes. But what they don't realize is that God's grace is always there to pick them back up. But at the same time, God's grace, it teaches us to not only lust. God disciplines us for our own good. Kind of like an earthly father does. It disciplines us as a heavenly Father does the same way, for to instruct us. And that's why it's important when you do get in trouble, or when something does happen in your life where you do make a mistake and something happens, you learn from it, and you ask God for forgiveness, and you move forward. And I think people who post the grace card are usually toxic people, or they're just insecure and they don't want to get in trouble, because it makes them feel like they're the bad guy when they're not. People get in trouble all the time. It's important to realize that there's consequences to your actions, and even though there's mercy and grace in time of need, there are times when we have to deal with sin. There's times when people have to deal with sin with us. And that's why it's important when it comes to dealing with sin that's dealt with in a loving and graceful manner. And if it's not done in a loving, graceful manner to where it benefits both parties involved, then it ends up being a toxic thing. I know people who say there's no grace for you because you did this sin, when God's already forgiven that person of that sin. They need to receive that forgiveness. And I've known in situations where people withhold forgiveness because of what's been done, and they want to, and that just destroys organization. That just destroys relationships. Even the Bible says in the book of Proverbs that an offense can separate close friends. And the best thing to do when it comes to, if you're a leader of something, an organization, to deal with the sin properly in a way that's beneficial to both parties involved. And when it's beneficial to both parties involved, then the situation can be dealt with in a peaceful manner. And when that person repents and moves forward, then they can forgive that person, and that person doesn't feel like that they're unforgiven in their organization. Now I'm talking from a Christian perspective, so to speak. But what I mean by when it comes to pulling the grace card is when you're like trying to win sympathy or trying to get out of consequences or hopefully they won't deal with this sin but allow me to sin all I want to, which that's very destructive. Anyways, and that's why it's important to understand that even when consequences are meted out, because that sin and consequences are just the part of life, that there's always grace for you when you turn to the Lord and ask Him to forgive you, and He will. You may have to walk through the consequences, but God's already forgiving you of that, and you learn from it, and you move forward. So I just want to encourage you. Maybe you're here today, and maybe you've done something wrong, and you haven't forgiven yourself for it because someone's told you that there's no grace for it. And I just want to encourage you that there's grace in Jesus Christ for that sin. If you ask Him to forgive you of that sin, people may not show you grace. People may hold it against you, or they may not. They may keep in the back of their heads. But I just want to encourage you that God's already forgiven you of that sin. And I understand when someone sins, you gotta make sure that it doesn't happen again. So you gotta be on guard about that. That's just normal. But I'm saying don't let people put you in a prison of guilt, shame, and condemnation because of what you've done and stuff. To just learn from it and move forward. So remember, grace teaches us. That's why God disciplines us for our own good, so that we can grow and become the people that God's called us to be. And there's nothing wrong with getting rebuked and corrected. We're all at a works in progress. We're all growing together as Christians. I'm talking about Christians here. We're all growing together, and we're all learning, and we're all maturing. And I think that's why it's important to understand that, to not be so hard on yourself when you do make mistakes, but when you do make them, learn from them, and accept God's grace as a teaching tool in your life to help you move forward and receive His love and forgiveness, so you can walk in freedom. And that's my prayer for you. God bless you.